All right, today we'll be talking about technical session number 43, security settings within Windows. Our objectives for this course will be to define the different types of user access. We'll be getting into the various types of users there are, being administrator, power user, standard user, guest account, which hopefully we've all gone in and disabled on our computers. Describe new technology file systems, or NTFS, and how it intends to address some of these security threats that we face on a regular basis. Compare and contrast the various NTFS directory and file permissions, and describe single sign-on, Bitlocker, and encryption file systems. For this particular technical session, we want to keep in mind adaptability and personal responsibility. Whenever we're talking about security, personal responsibility is a big part of it. Remembering to secure and lock our stations before we walk away from them. Being sure to train end users as to the types of threats that are out there, and trying to be ever vigilant for social engineering attacks, as we are all susceptible, no matter how much we would like to believe we are not. Also, to incorporate some adaptability into our lives, understand that the threats that are being posed upon our systems are ever changing, ever evolving, and we have to change and evolve to be able to confront these threats to our systems. All right, Windows users, accounts, and groups. A group is essentially a container that holds user accounts and defines the capabilities of its members. Like, we could set up groups for HR, groups for accounting, groups for operations, groups for sales. Each of these groups would have different permissions, different authorizations, what they're allowed to use, what they're not allowed to use, different access to particular servers, what data they can see, what things they are allowed to do in the systems. Is often said in accounting that you need to have multiple layers of access in order to be able to protect your finances. Like, the same person that authorizes payments cannot be the same person that cuts the checks. That creates a secondary check upon what is being authorized. It drops the capability that somebody can embezzle funds from the company significantly, because instead of having one person involved, you now need to have two. Also, job rotations, making sure that you don't have the same people doing the same thing over long periods of time. You do cross training and you rotate these people through these various job functions. And that also is a security measure to kind of help prevent people over time from beginning to work together in a sense that would be against the company. So, but from a computer system standpoint, groups are a very efficient way to manage multiple users, especially in whole network, like an entire network of accounts. Standalone computers can rely on groups as well. It also helps when you're bringing people on board. If I know they're going to be in accounting, I put them in the accounting group. I will image their computer with the accounting image, and that will give them all the permissions, all the security access that they will need for that particular system. It actually makes things significantly more efficient. I don't have to go from computer to computer and change each of these permissions individually. I create groups, and within these groups, they have this access, and then that access kind of permeates down to the other users. A single account can be a member of multiple groups. So you may have a scenario where somebody's doing a lateral move, say going from accounting to HR, or from HR to accounting. And there may be some crossover time where during the training period, while they're in accounting, they will obviously need access to the accounting things, but they may also be in turn training their replacement in HR. So they still need access to their previous job functions and systems. So there may be some crossover time. There also may be access where sales may need to have access to accounting, but only say once a quarter when they're doing taxes and financial reportings and stuff like that. So a single user or account can be a member of multiple groups. There are four main types of groups we will be talking about. You have your administrative group, you have your power users, which we're learning about right now, your users group, and then your guest group. So administrative group has the power to do pretty much anything in the system, from the smallest task all the way up to removing the operating system. It is the most powerful of all users. Now, who to give the access to? Any member of the administrative group has complete administrator privileges. To protect against doing mistakes, the practice of logging in with the administrator account for daily interaction is strongly discouraged. We should only ever log into our administrator account at the moment we need administrative privileges, and then we immediately log out. It lessens the attack vector on that particular account and makes it significantly less likely over time that that account will be compromised. So in order to maintain that, always do everything you can as a standard user and only log into the administrative account for the sole purpose of the administrative access. Power users. This gives users read and write permission to the system, allowing them to install most software, but keeping them from changing key operating system files. This is particularly significant for those who need to test software, such as programmers, app developers, scripters, things of that nature, as well as junior administrators. You know, when you're starting to get out of the help desk field and start, you know, moving up the ladder, junior administrator tends to be your next leap out of help desk. You will essentially be given, for the most part, power user access, a power user access account, which again, much like your administrator account, use a standard account as much as you can and only log into your elevated privileges when absolutely necessary. Standard users. They have standard read and write permissions to their own profile, but they cannot modify any system-wide registry settings, and they have no access to critical file systems or system files, excuse me. This is your everyday users on the group. This would be the operating people. This would be your accounting, your HR. All these people would be standard users. And for 80% of your daily activities, you would be a standard user. Lastly, we have our guest accounts. These tend to have the same rights as users, except they cannot get to log files. This is essentially an account that is created by default and is a member of the guest group. The best reason to make somebody a member of the guest group is if they're only going to have access to the system for a short period of time. However, in general, this in real life, with regards to security, you want to disable the guest account wherever possible and just create a standard user account that would be a guest and give it almost zero privileges except for maybe internet access. Questions so far? All right. configuring users and groups. So every version of Windows includes 1 or 2 users and group management tools. Most editions include the control panel applet, which we should be very familiar with by this point, called user accounts. More advanced editions may include a utility called local users and groups. Here up at the top, see our map, user accounts, and family safety user accounts. This is where you can add or remove users from your system. All right, UAC, or user account control. This is a particular applet or system that is intended to prevent unintentional or unauthorized changes to the computer by either prompting for permission to continue or requiring the administrator password for continuing. You can set this for pretty much the entire control panel. If they want to change anything in the control panel, they need to be prompted for permission, or which, they would have to have the user sign in a password or something along those, or the user sign in and password. And the prompting for permission, what it may say is do you want to request permission from this? And it will send a message to the local administrator and ask them if you want to allow it. And then you will either accept or reject that. That is user account control. It was introduced, I believe, in Vista and works for both the standard and administrator accounts. To make it less aggressive, Microsoft included 4 UAC levels in Windows 7, which is always notify me only when programs try to make changes to my PC, notify me only when programs try to make changes to my computer, do not dim my desktop, and never notify. Most people, when they first get their computer, they're like, I want the best security possible. And they'll throw it all the way up to always notify. They'll throw their firewall to the highest settings. And then it takes them about 15 minutes, usually, before they become so thoroughly annoyed, they go back in and turn all these features off. Because it becomes very, very surprising how many times programs try to access the internet, programs try to make changes to your PC, programs try to make changes to the computer, everything. It is extremely annoying to the average person. However, if you are security minded, you might want to have an idea as to what's going on in your PC. You may not go for the full on always notify me, but you may go notify me when it's trying to make changes to my PC. The one step below the maximum. And give yourself, at least some heads up if it's trying to change, system files or something along those lines. Now, again, as with all things security, what are we trying to balance? Said it quite a few times.
Convenience? Well, I know with security, yeah. I know. Okay, I want to make sure I was thinking the right direction, because with you, Kelly, I never know if you're my friend or not. So it's as far as security, like when I think of security, I literally said all weekend, this weekend, Kelly, I promise you, the more secure, the more convenient, the less secure it is. I say that to like 2 family members and friends. So is that what you're confirming?
Yes, ma'am. That's exactly what I'm confirming. It's that security versus convenience. The more convenient you make something, the less secure it is. The more, and that goes with almost all aspects of life. Like I can put 30 deadbolts on my front door. It's extremely secure, but it's not very convenient if I got to get outside quickly. I could take my computer, unplug it from everything, put it in a steel box, and bury it in my backyard. It's extremely secure. It's highly unlikely I will get any viruses from the internet while it's out there. But unfortunately, if I need to do anything, I got to go out there, I got to dig it up, I got to plug it back in, turn it on, probably run some updates, and then go onto the internet. So very inconvenient if I want to actually, do day-to-day tasks. So it's that security versus convenience. I could take my credit cards and I could put them in a safety deposit box in a bank. very secure. Nobody's stealing my credit cards. You know, my kids aren't going to come by and grab my credit card and go on iTunes and buy a whole bunch of stuff, you know, but very inconvenient. If I like have a flat tire or something like that and I need my credit cards, I would now have to get to the bank, wait for them to be open, go into a security box, get my credit cards out, and then I can use them. So it's that security convenience balance that we always have. Here, it falls into that same thing. It's more secure. It's telling you everything that's going on in the computer, but it's extremely inconvenient because it's stopping you every 30 seconds to a minute to tell you that something has changed on your computer. So we have to find that balance. What is your risk appetite? How much risk are you willing to accept in order to have the convenience to do the things that you want to do on a day-to-day basis? Same thing in business. How much risk are you willing to accept in order to allow daily operations to become as or have as few interruptions as possible? Parental controls, one of my personal favorites. I have a lot of fun with this, especially with my family. It is essentially an administrator account can monitor and or limit activities of any standard user in Windows. Also, on Macs, they have something similar, but this is for Windows settings specifically. It is supposed to be meant for parents and managers. Excellent. It gives you kind of a really good level of control of the type of content that is allowed, you know, for either children or for employees. It can also limit the amount of time a standard user can log in. So with kids, you may say, I want you to have no more than 30 minutes of internet access every day. So after 30 minutes, it cuts off. From a business perspective, you may say you can only have access to the system. So say you work 8 to 5. You can only have access to the systems from 7 to 6. So in case you come in a little early one day, or you happen to stay a little late one day, gives you a little bit of a buffer, but I don't want you logging in at, you know, 2 o'clock in the morning, poking around files, looking for stuff. So that would be a security feature. It would only allow you to log in during specific times of the day. It also could be like, it prevents people from like spoofing your account. Like, you know, I come in, I'm trying to log in at 3 o'clock in the morning. I'm pretending to be Mark. I have Mark sign in because Mark sent me an email. So I now know his email. And now I'm going to try to brute force or use a dictionary attack on his password to get into the system. So I'm going to do this at 3 o'clock in the morning, you know, because there'll be less people monitoring the systems at that time. Well, lo and behold, they have time requirements where Mark can't log in at 3 o'clock in the morning. So it helps limit your exposure to attack to specific times when the employee should be working. Technically, if you wanted to get super paranoid, you could shut it off. Like if the employee says they're going to go on vacation for 2 weeks, you could shut off their access for 2 weeks and have it come back on when they return. I mean, you can take it to that level if you want. Some companies do, many don't. But again, that is something you would have control. Is there no way to bypass their time limits for access to the system? Yeah, there's probably programs you can use to do it. But for the most part, for the purposes of this, you would need administrative access to be able to adjust their time. And there may be a scenario where, you know, they let their boss know, hey, I was out on Monday. I'm going to make up that time, work until about 8 or 9 o'clock every night. And then the manager would have to let the administrator know, hey, can you please allow extended access during these dates for this particular employee? All right. NTFS, or New Technology File System, was introduced with Windows NT to handle growing disk sizes, security concerns, and the need for more stability. As we remember talking about Windows file systems, it offered encryption, it offered security level access, it allowed us to get to much larger drive sizes, things like that. So with NTFS, files, directories, volumes can each have their own level of security, which is nice. You don't have to have that across the entire system. You can isolate it to particular parts as you see fit. It's relatively flexible, and thank goodness it is built in, because with almost all security options, we want to take a layered approach, as we know there is no silver bullet. There is no one thing that is just going to make your system completely secure, unless that means you're going to unplug it and bury it in the backyard. That'll make it very secure. Unfortunately, there would be zero convenience with that. But for the most part, we take a layered approach. We have multiple layers to our security. Helps protect our systems and make it less of a target per se than somebody else's system. Now, one thing to keep in mind, thankfully, it is possible to convert file systems from FAT32 to NTFS without losing the data, but you cannot go the other way. You cannot go from NTFS to FAT32 without essentially erasing all your data. Probably because you're adding these security measures and different, infrastructure pieces built upon it, and the process of stripping that away essentially makes the data irrecoverable. All right. Some of the NTFS security permissions we're going to be talking about. Permissions, file permissions specifically, directory permissions, single sign-on, a BitLocker, and EFS. All right. Permissions. Share permissions apply only when the user is accessing a file or a folder through the network themselves. Local permissions and attributes are used to protect the file when the user is local or only on their own system. So share permissions over the network, local permissions to that individual computer. So NTFS are able to protect at the file level rather than the entire drive. It can go down to a specific file. While share permissions can be applied to the directory level only, NTFS permissions can affect users logged in locally to that individual computer, or access, or across the network if you so choose, to the system where the NTFS permissions are applied. So share permissions, again, network related, only in effect when the user connects to that resource via a network. Local permissions, again, individual computer. So within the NTFS permissions for objects, remember they view files as objects in the NTFS, who fall into one of three categories: allow, not allow, and deny. And then the permissions that are set at the folder are inherited and cumulative. What it means when a user is local, it means the user is on that individual machine. So if you have three different people using that same computer, local permissions would determine which users would be allowed access to those files. It is local to that individual computer. Shared speaks to the network. So if I was sharing those files with Mark and Avery, that would be my share permissions over the network. Versus locally, that would be like with me and like my wife or my kids at this house, at my house on this individual computer. Yes, Glean.
Could you go back to the second slide very quickly, and then we can proceed from there. I promise to be fast.
This slide?
No, the second one.
Oh, you mean slide 2?
Yeah.
Yeah, Glenn, I think I noticed the same thing. There's 2 slide 3s.
Oh.
There's no slide 2 of 3. Yeah, I just was looking at.
Okay. All right.
Which one are you talking about?
In the NTFS permissions, you had 1/3, and then somehow I saw 3/3, and I'm thinking, okay, I guess I missed the second one. So that's why.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there's 2 3/3s. That's funny. Gotcha.
Okay.
Apologies.
So there's 2. All right. So yeah. So okay. My apologies.
So apologies. I didn't create slides, and they don't allow me to edit them. So here we have inherited permissions, or permissions that will go down through all the subfolders underneath that primary folder that you have moved over. So if I move a file from mine, my drive to Mark's drive, all the permissions that I have put in place will be inherited through all the subfolders within it, unless Mark goes in and changes those later. Then you have cumulative, which is if a member of a group that has a read permission and a member of the group has write permissions, they effectively have both read and write permissions. So those permissions are essentially stacking on each other or accumulating. All right. What is the difference between copying a file and moving a file? A copy of a file, essentially you're duplicating it and giving it to somebody else. They will generally have the permissions assigned to it that are placed on the newly created files in that folder, regardless of what permissions were in the original file. So if I copy one to another folder, whatever permissions are on that other folder, the copied file will take on those permissions. They will inherit those permissions. Now, if I move a file, on the other hand, it will attempt to keep all the same permissions that it has from its original location. So copying takes on the permissions of the place where it was copied to. Moving a file tries to maintain the original permissions from the file, even from the file it was moved from. I would take a snapshot of this and understand the difference between copying and moving, because you will likely receive a question on this during the A+. I remember getting at least 1 or 2 between copying and moving. We good? All right, NTFS file permissions. So you have full control, read and execute, write, and modify. So full control essentially means that a user is able to take, or has permission to take ownership and change permissions. So if Glean creates a file, gives me full control, I can now take ownership of that and change the permissions. Like I can say that it is strictly my file and actually give Glean lower permissions if I so choose. because I would have full control. Then you have read, which allows the user to view the contents of the file and to see ownership attributes, which is nice because I can sit there and I can look at that file. I can see that Glean owns that file, and then I can contact Glean if I need to make any changes to it. And then you have execute, read and execute, which combines the read permission and the ability to execute. So if there are executable files within it, I would then be able to execute those files. Like if they were scripting a code or something like that, or a program, I would be able to execute from that file. If I do not have that permission, I would only be able to read the descriptions of it and look at the owner permissions. Then you have write, which allows the user to overwrite the file, as well as to change the attributes and then see ownership and permissions. And if you have modify, that is a combination of the read and execute with the write permissions. So you could both read and execute and write. And then it also allows the user to delete the file should they so choose. So if you don't want to have them to have that delete permission, you would give them read and execute and write. You wouldn't necessarily give them modify. And when you right click on a file, go into permissions, or not permissions, but properties. And then you would see this screen here. You can go into security and you can change the permissions for that file. I know what you're thinking. Is there a lab where we can practice this? Yes, I promise you there is. There's also one that you can practice file permissions in Linux too. So I do encourage you to do those labs more than once, develop that muscle memory. So when somebody asks you to do something like this, you can just go in and do it real quickly without having to think about it. Directory permissions look very similar to our file permissions. Full control, same thing, allows you to take ownership of the directory or any of its content and change permissions. Read allows the user to navigate the entire directory structure, view the contents of the directory, view the contents of any files in the directory, and see the ownership and attributes therein. Read and execute combines the permissions of read with those of list folder contents and add-ons and the ability to run executables within those directories. And write allows the user to create new entities within the folder, as well as change the attributes within them. And then list folder, which is a new one, allows the user to view the contents of the directory and to navigate into its subdirectories. And finally, modify combines read and execute permission with the write permission, and then also, like with the files, allows the user to delete anything and everything they choose. Questions so far? And again, from the directory level, looks very similar to our file level. All right, single sign-on. How many of us have gone through password overload? We've had 20, 30 passwords. It gets frustrating. We're trying to create these unique and awesome, highly secure passwords or passphrases for every different thing we have across the entire network. It can become exhausting, especially if you have to change these passwords every 3 months. And it's just thoroughly frustrating. Well, single sign-on to the rescue. It is essentially used to authenticate and give users access to all the applications and systems that they need when they log in. So you log into your main system. Once you log into the main system, it authenticates you and it says, okay, Vincent's now allowed access to email. He's now allowed access to the operations system. He's now allowed access to HR. Whatever he needs access to, it will give him access, even though each one of those systems may be unique and individual passwords and sign-ins for everything. The single sign-on system will allow that authentication. So he only has to sign in one time and allows him access to everything else. Yes, Julian.
Does it exist in a Mac?
I think you're thinking of Keychain, which is more like, that falls more to the password manager. But in enterprise systems, they would use things like Kerberos, which is, it's like a system that grants tickets. Essentially, when you sign in, it gives you a ticket, and that ticket will give you access to everything else because those other things trust Kerberos to authenticate you. Whereas on your computer, you have a password manager where it just kind of maintains all your passwords. So it's a little bit different.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So there's a few different environments that use single sign-on. Kerberos, like we just mentioned, which has ticket granting tickets. You have Microsoft Access or Active Directory, which we have talked about a few times. That's a good one to practice on and get on your resume. Novel eDirectory, and then some certificate model implementations. And getting into certificates and things like that is a little bit beyond the scope of this course. But if you start diving into network and security, you will be learning a lot more about that. All right, there are many benefits to using the single sign-on. You only have to remember a single sign-in and password. Reduces that password fatigue that we may feel logging into 20 different systems. And it still kind of helps retain security through these complex passwords. Saves time for your employees having to re-enter and authenticate these data over and over and over again. And it reduces IT costs related to help desk tickets about passwords. Only problem is if somebody cracks that original sign-in and password, they are granted access to everything you have access to. That's the downfall of the single sign-in. So instead of them having to get into each individual system, once they crack the first layer, it kind of gives them that golden ticket through the network, which with whatever you had authorization for. All right, Bitlocker. Talked about this one a few times, which is whole drive encryption. It encrypts the entire drive. Not sure who that was. So it encrypts the entire drive. It can also seal a device such that it will not boot if any system files are altered. If anything changes, the Bitlocker will not allow it to be booted from that point. It can also lock the drive to a particular machine, preventing somebody from stealing that hard drive and using it on another system. What mystical item do they use in order to lock it to that machine? Piece of hardware. Not a cable lock.
What's your question?
So it says it can lock the drive to a particular machine, meaning the drive will only be accessed if it's in my computer. If somebody steals that drive and tries to access it somewhere else, it will not be able to. So what is it? What is the system using in order to lock it? Rachel.
Trusted Platform Module.
The Trusted Platform Module, or TPM. Lorraine also got it in the chat. Nice. So Trusted Platform Module, that is a chip, a firmware chip that is soldered onto the motherboard. Uniquely identifies that motherboard from every other one and allows you to use full drive encryption and lock it to that particular computer. If they don't have the motherboard to go with that drive, they aren't getting in that system. Now we do have a slightly stripped down version of this called Bitlocker to Go, which provides the same encryption technology to help prevent unauthorized access to files that are stored on removable drives like USBs or external hard drives. So Bitlocker to Go. Questions, comments? All right. Where Bitlocker encrypts the entire drive, everything on it, you now have EFS or encrypting file system that does kind of the same thing, but to the individual file level. It's built into Windows Vista Business, Enterprise and Ultimate, and then on 7, 8, 8.1 Professional and Enterprise, and then 10 Professional, Enterprise, or Education. Can only be used on NTFS volumes, but thankfully it is pretty easy to use. So it encrypts file like in the individual file level, whereas Bitlocker is the entire drive. All right, man, did we get through this already? No, we got a quiz. Don't worry. I know you guys were feeling neglected there. You needed some little something extra to go with it. All right, just a couple minutes. Oh, let me pause that recording.